Hi, welcome to our video series, Parental Alienation, a Silent Epidemic. A few weeks back, you would have noticed that we spoke to Dr. William Burnett about parental alienation, the five-factor model for diagnosing it, and touched upon its impact on children and why courts need to be proactive in managing this severe form of child abuse. Now we're going to deep dive a little more further into parental alienation. And for doing that, we have with us Dr. Alan Blotcky. Dr. Alan Blotcky, or Alan as I would like to call him, is a clinical and forensic psychologist in private practice and clinical associate professor, Department of Psychology at the University of Alabama at Birmingham. His forensic practice focuses on divorce, child custody, parental alienation, and something that is of great interest to us today, which is false allegations of abuse. He has published a number of articles in Psychiatric Times on parental alienation and false allegations of abuse. Link to some of those articles will be provided in the description below. He's managed hundreds of cases of parental alienation, and his testimony in many cases has resulted in court arriving at the right decision, including removing the abusive or the alienating parent from the life of the child. So without much ado, welcome, Alan. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you for inviting me. I look forward to talking with you and helping the folks who are listening and answering your questions and getting a better understanding of false allegations and parental alienation.
Wonderful. Thank you. So let's deep dive straight. So you've had the chance to go through our survey findings. And what our survey findings reveal is something that was very, very shocking to me personally, which revealed that as per the legal professionals, that is the judges and lawyers, 54% of the cases have clear-cut false allegations of abuse. Secondly, what is even more surprising and shocking to me was that 1 in 6, that is more than 15% of cases, have false allegations of sexual abuse. Now, these figures actually to me are extremely, extremely worrying. However, what I would want to know is, as a forensic psychologist, how do you go about evaluating such allegations? And what is your advice for judges and attorneys that how should they prima facie look at these allegations of abuse against a child, especially in child custody disputes?
Yeah, especially in child custody disputes is the key phrase, because I think the context of that changes the dynamics of everything. Normally you take an allegation of abuse seriously, and I'm not suggesting that anybody not do that. The first thing I would tell attorneys and judges is not to overreact, not to make any sudden decisions until the allegations have been investigated and have been understood as best they can. So what I like to do is to look at the timeline. A timeline of events will oftentimes explain why this allegation of abuse is coming up right now. Has a motion been filed? Has there been an argument between mom and dad? Has there been some other triggering point that will help explain why a false allegation of abuse is being lodged right now? So I literally do timelines. I will plot out the different events that have gone on that will help explain why this allegation is coming up now. The other red flag that I look for is this. Sometimes parents during a custody dispute will come up with multiple allegations of abuse against the other parent. Much more often than not, when you have multiple allegations during the divorce proceeding, that's a red flag for fabrication. It just doesn't make sense for the other parent to be engaging in some kind of abusive behavior during the divorce proceeding. So when there are multiple allegations, that's usually a red flag. But the main thing is for everybody to take it seriously, but to not make any rush or harsh or hasty decisions about moving the child or doing this or doing that until the allegation has been investigated.
Right. Now, so one of the other things that comes into play is, specifically in Indian context, that investigation really in the family court system, there isn't really a very serious set of investigators or investigation tools which are available. It is more like he said, she said, which typically goes on. And a large amount of time is conceded during this, during which time the children do not have access to the one parent who's supposedly or allegedly the abusive parent, right? So, is that something that is of great concern? Is that something that can be handled?
Yeah, I mean, that happens all the time. I can tell you 3 or 4 cases I have right now where that's exactly happened, where a mother has lodged an allegation of sexual abuse against the father, and now we're working on a year since this father has seen his daughter. So usually that's another red flag. When somebody lodges an allegation against another parent, but yet they're stalling and stalling and stalling about getting
Yes.
into court, that's a red flag. And that is a major problem. And really, the judges need to be much more attuned to that dynamic because they're the ones who can stop the attempts at stalling. And stalling can go on for months, if not years.
True.
So it is a problem.
It is. So, is there a kind of a rule of thumb? So, like a lot of times, what we believe is that the false allegations are by and large harmless. They're just born out of anger. But fine, they overburden the justice system, which is one. However, in child custody disputes, they are used as a deliberate ploy or a tactic to try and achieve an ulterior motive.
Right.
How does this fit in, as a strategy or a ploy or a tool? How does it work?
Well, that's exactly how it works. People now know that if you lodge an allegation of abuse against the other parent, that sidetracks the whole process. Okay,
Yeah.
it slows it down. It can literally stop it. Even I have had some cases where not only do they make an allegation of abuse, but they go to the police to try to make it a criminal charge because
Yes.
they know that once it becomes a criminal issue, that stops the family case in its tracks. So they know that if you want to keep a parent away from a child, the best way to do it is to lodge an allegation of abuse, especially sexual abuse. Is it harmless? It's never harmless. And that's a mistake for attorneys and judges to think, oh, that's just a parent being overzealous. Oh, that's just a parent being overprotective. No, that's a parent who, in some cases of severe alienation, is considered child abuse. So the alienation process itself is considered child abuse, especially when it's moderate to severe alienation. So it's clearly a strategy that a parent uses in order to get something, and the something is to keep the other parent away, to block the case from moving forward, and then they just sit back and wait it out as long as they can. It happens all the time.
True.
Who can stop it? The attorneys can stop it. The judge can stop it. The mental health expert, if appointed, or if there's a mental health expert involved, that person can help stop it. But it needs to be stopped.
True. No, actually, like I always say, that relative isolation that they are able to achieve between the parent and the child is something that acts as a huge amount of fodder for these parents or the time that they need to poison the child against the other parent because they need that gap for a certain period of time And by providing that gap, actually, the court system or the investigation system abets child abuse, is how I would actually look at it.
Right.
But moving on, yeah, sorry.
No, that's absolutely correct. Again, stalling, 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 which gives the alienation process longer to solidify and to make it worse.
True, true. So now let's move ahead to simply say, now that over a period of about year, let's say a year. I mean, year is too small in Indian judicial system because it works in decades rather than in years. But even if I were to say 1 year, right? And it has been, conclusively found that one or couple of allegations which have been made have been found to be false, right? Therefore, how should the courts, and we see the child is now resisting contact with the parent who was falsely alleged to be an abuser. How should courts go about handling such a situation? Because now the child is resisting contact, the allegations have been found to be false. So how should courts now deal with this?
Well, okay, so let's take those one at a time. Anytime an allegation of abuse is proven to be false, false meaning fabricated purposely by the parent,
Yeah.
there need to be consequences. If you don't have consequences, why would the person stop doing it, right? So there need to be negative consequences. They need to be told that it cannot happen again. They need to be told that if it happens again, that the consequence will be decreased parenting time or change of custody or court ordered therapy, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. There need to be clear consequences spelled out. Now, to the other part of that, if you have a child who is so severely alienated that that child absolutely repetitively refuses to see the other parent.
Yes.
And if an intervention does not get off the ground to help improve that, then removing the child from the alienating parent can be done and should be done. And I have seen it done. Okay. Now I'm talking about the severest cases. Okay.
Yeah.
Now, if you have a child who moans and groans about going to see the other parent, but still goes, that's different. That's a less severe form of parental alienation.
Yeah.
They need treatment, and we can talk about treatment. But for the most severe cases, removing the child from the offending parent is usually the first thing that needs to happen. You need to extricate the child from that alienation process, and the only way to do it is to get the child away from the parent in the worst cases.
Okay. So, I was just thinking about it. You mentioned two very important things. One is about the therapy, both for the parents and the child in moderate cases. And the second is removing the child from the abusive atmosphere or abusive home that the child is in. So let's take that one by one. So let's talk first about removing the child. So one of the judges from the High Court, I was speaking to him, and he said, how can you even suggest alienating the child from one parent in order to cure the alienation with the other parent?
Okay, so that tells me he doesn't understand what parental alienation is. Alienation is not living with a parent. Okay. Alienation is the psychological and emotional desire to reject the parent. Those are two different things. Yeah. So we're talking about removing a child from a parent who is being abusive. Here's the bottom line. Severe parental alienation should be considered on par with sexual abuse and physical abuse. No different. They're different, but they're on the same level. Okay.
Yeah.
So we have to, just like we remove a child for sexual abuse and we remove a child for physical abuse, we should remove a child for parental alienation abuse.
Right.
So that comment from the judge tells me that he doesn't really understand what parental alienation is.
True. Now, because another judge actually, when I was speaking to him, he said the parent who does parental alienation is doing so because that parent loves the child so much. And in a way, I was a little aghast at what that person said, but I think somewhere the confusion between love and possession was a very badly blurred between the two, a bit in the mind of the judge, of
Yeah,
course.
and I think exactly what you find with a lot of parents who do engage in severe alienation, they do see their children as possessions, as extensions of themselves. They have problems with sort of self-other boundary.
Right.
And I think that's exactly what happens. And let's not confuse a sense of possession with love. Those are two different things. Possessing a child is not loving a child.
True. True.
And again, that judge doesn't quite get it.
True. And which is true for a lot of judges all across the world, I would say.
That's
But
right. Exactly right.
uh, yeah. Now, but so moving into the other part that you talked about, which is the therapies of. So a lot of people. So I was dealing with the case just yesterday, and I was talking to somebody who's been appointed by court to evaluate the child, and he said to me, "What we need to do now is because the child is resisting contact." So he said two things. Number one, that the child needs therapy. He didn't talk about the parents, he just spoke about the child needs therapy. And second, we need to go very slow into moving into this arena. What are your thoughts about that?
So different people have different ideas about treatment. There's a lot of overlap among people's views, and I think my experience here in Birmingham, Alabama, with the court system has sort of shaped the way I see things. If
Yeah.
you talk to somebody else in a different part of the country who may have a different experience in the court system, they may have a slightly different view. What I will tell you is this: when you come across a case of moderate to severe parental alienation, all three parties need intervention: the offending parent, the alienated child, and the rejected parent. All three of them need intervention. Now, we might argue a little bit about what that intervention needs to be, the order in which things need to occur. But I think what everybody probably would agree upon is this: that the offending parent needs individual therapy, and that the alienated child and the rejected parent together need family therapy.
Right.
Now, in my experience here, um, what I just described to you will work as long as the judge or the guardian ad litem or whoever the treatment team leader is sets the stage for the offending parent to be involved in individual therapy, for the alienated child and the rejected parent to be involved in family therapy.
Okay.
But where I stand, what if the offending parent is not asked to be involved in individual therapy or refuses it?
Yeah.
That changes the whole dynamics and it makes treatment even harder. So the key to it is having a firm judge, a firm guardian ad litem, and a firm treatment team leader who can put the intervention into play. If you have all that, then what I just described to you is probably the best way to do it.
But let me pose you the other way round question, because at the end of the day, the Indian family court system is not as well developed as the American system. It is short on resources, it is short on a
Right,
number of things, right?
right.
So that whole team is not available.
Okay.
Let's be honest, right?
Yeah.
We
Yeah.
have a child with moderate to severe alienation. Let's look at it optimistically as saying the moderate alienation.
Okay.
Uh, do you think that the child, while in the custody of the alienating parent, and even if the alienating parent goes to a traditional therapist, a traditional psychologist, psychiatrist team, in your experience, does that work?
Okay. So if the offending parent goes to therapy, the therapy has to be targeted on the alienation. When you say they go to a traditional therapist, um, that that concerns me. Yes, a psychologist or psychiatrist can certainly do it, but the focus of the therapy at that moment is on getting the offending parent to understand and to stop their alienating behavior. Okay.
Yes.
If that occurs, then yes, things can move along and get better.
Mhm. But in my experience, and I was just wondering if that is true in your experience too, has been that a large percentage of these alienating parents do suffer from personality disorders, typically the cluster B, borderline, or narcissistic.
Yeah.
Uh, who we all as understand as medical professionals is one of the most resistant to treatment kind of disorders, right? Would you agree with that, or what is your opinion on that?
I agree with that completely. Again, though, I would keep it targeted on behavior as much as you can. In other words, here are the things you're doing, ma'am, or here are the things you're doing, sir. These are the things that are hurtful to your child and have to stop. So I would keep it as behavioral as possible in order to make a dent into it as quickly as possible. Yes, offending parents often have personality disorders. That's the reality. And I think it does make it harder. It makes it a challenge. But getting them in therapy, keeping them in therapy, and focusing on the alienating behavior gives you a fighting chance to make a real difference.
Right, right. Now, just moving, since that was the alienating parent, let's move to the realm of, the targeted parent and
Yeah,
the child, right?
right,
The one that is talked about as reunification therapy, so to speak, which you mentioned.
right.
Uh, how do you find that? Is that something that's successful?
That is something that is hugely successful, provided that the offending parent really is ceasing the alienating behavior. I think if the pressure of that comes off, then children and their targeted parent can reunify fairly easily, as
Right,
long as the alienating behavior has been reduced or stopped. If it hasn't been reduced or stopped, then the child finds him or herself in a bind again. Because
right,
even if that child wants to reach out to the targeted parent and wants to reconnect with the targeted parent, they're kind of paralyzed by the offending parent still doing the alienating behavior. So the
right.
trick is making sure that has receded. Once that's receded, then the reunification, I think, can take off, and usually takes off in mild to moderate cases for sure.
Right. But in severe cases, a period of what we call as therapeutic isolation is something that needs to be practiced. But, one more
Not,
question.
not all judges understand that. Not all judges understand that. I've had a few cases where they understand it and they did it. But I've also had cases where the judges refuse to do it because they see it as a severe response. And what I try to explain to them is that a severe alienation demands a severe response.
Right. Right.
Sometimes it happens, sometimes it doesn't.
True. No, like you mentioned, I think your example of sexual abuse is something that should convince. But, the other thing which worries a lot of these judges is if I were to just unsettle the child and move him from one environment to the other, it may harm the child. What's been your experience? Has there been any follow up studies on children who've been done isolated or therapeutically terminated from
Yeah,
how?
there's been research, and it's clearly shown that it is helpful to the child, not harmful. And
Okay.
again, it's one of those counterintuitive things that I write about
Yeah.
parental alienation. It sort of makes sense on the surface. You don't want to just go in and pluck a kid away from home and transfer him to a different environment. But the
True.
truth is, in severe alienation, it's exactly what you need to do. You need to extricate that child away from the offending parent.
Yeah.
And the process of plucking that child away from the offending parent has
Mhm.
not been shown to be harmful at all in all the research that's been done.
Huh. Excellent. So you mentioned a right word, which I keep telling a lot of the people I interact with, saying counterintuitive, right? So we'll step back and let's look at some of the things. So one of the things that a lot of people say is that parental alienation is two parents fighting with each other, and they are both equally responsible for the damage to the child. What do you have to say on that?
Well, so that's one of the points I bring out in a recent article, which is it's not usually true that both parents are equally responsible for the conflict. Now, I'm not saying that it's never true,
Sure.
but more often than not, if you really look at it, one parent is more responsible for the conflict than another parent. I have a case right now
Yes.
where even some of the counselors have said both parents are participating in creating a problem for this child. My argument to that, though, is if you look in the weeds, yes, both parents are contributing, but they're not equal, and they're not even close to being equal. And so that's the case I would make, is that more often than not, both parents are not equally responsible for the problems in the family. One is more responsible than the other.
No, fair, fair, absolutely. And that is what I try and tell them, that what we do actually end up seeing in a lot of these cases is that one parent is the aggressor while the other parent is just fighting
Right,
to stay alive in the child's life.
right.
And in
In,
exchange,
in a very
maybe.
de- in a very desperate, anxious kind of way.
Yes, yes, yes. And which is what we also read a lot about. The targeted parents come across as very angry, anxious, agitated, the four A's, which you mentioned about, while the alienating parent in the court comes across as very four C's, as the cool, charming, and the very controlled person.
Right.
So
So if you ask a professional which of those two probably is causing the problem, they're
right,
going to pick the agitated, angry, upset one, when in
yeah,
fact it's just the opposite.
true. True. No, absolutely. The other thing that a lot of people, so I've seen certain cases where, the people come across and they say, look, this child seems to be doing very well in school. The school grades are reasonably well. So obviously the alienating parent, even if we agree that this person, he or she is alienating, seems to be doing a good job, right? How would you respond to that?
Well, my response to that is it's fantastic that the child is doing well in school, but it certainly doesn't tell the whole story. I've had child after child after child whose grades maintain, but yet is embroiled in a great deal of tension and conflict and alienation. My only point is school grades are an easy thing to look at, but it doesn't tell the whole story. And
Right.
don't be fooled by just because a child is making A's and B's doesn't mean that that child's psychological, family, and social functioning is fine. Those are two very different things.
True. Now, that's what I really try and say, that the social and the emotional quotient is rarely ever measured in school,
Right,
right?
right.
And if I don't know, if I were to go back to my school days, I asked them, among your alums, whom you were your peers, were the ones who were doing the best in school in grades are the most successful people or the most, and the answer always comes no.
Right, right,
It's a lot of times the backbenchers which are doing far better because they are psychologically and emotionally far more attuned to the world at times, not
right,
always, but at
right,
times with
right, right.
yeah. Yeah. So moving on to the thing is, the other thing that a lot of parents tell me is, and I see a lot of these cases, sometimes we hear both the parents complaining about alienation happening. That both the mother and the father saying she's alienating, no, he is alienating. How do we go about really looking into such cases?
Well, I think you have to look at the whole picture, okay? And I think the system itself isn't good at this. The legal system is not good at this. Why? Because mom has an attorney, dad has an attorney, the child has an attorney, then you have the judge. Everybody sees a particular part of the overall picture, but not any of those people see the entire global picture. So that's where a mental health evaluator or mental health professional can make a difference.
Right.
Because when I'm asked to get involved, I want to see the whole picture. I want to
Right.
see mom and dad, the child, so that I can figure out who is the alienator, who is the victim, what is the dynamic that's going on in the family. And if I can have access to everybody as best I can figure that out.
Right. Right. But any rules of thumb or any way, any tools that you can tell us which you feel would be helpful?
The tools are a lot of interviewing,
Okay.
talking to mom, talking to dad, talking to the kids, finding out what they're thinking. Usually, people will tell you eventually. Um, Testing wise, I give the parents the MMPI-2, which is a personality test, which gives me more information about them. I also use what's called the sentence completion series, where the person finishes sentences, and that's a way of getting more information about what they're thinking and feeling and behaving and their intentions and their motivations. It really is a matter of plowing into the system and getting as much information as you can to figure it out, because things can get figured out.
Yeah. Right. I think, by and large, among, the hundreds of cases that I have personally seen, most of the times figuring out is not such a tough deal. The bigger problem is to get the entire system
Yeah,
to work on a therapeutic model which works. Is
right.
that the same there?
That's exactly right. I mean, I can have it all figured out. I can explain it in detail, but to then translate that into a treatment model can break down on so many levels, and that's often what happens. If it breaks down, it breaks down. But um, that's where I see myself as an educator. I try to educate attorneys. I try to educate judges about what it all means and what it all means as far as treatment goes. But it can be a very slow process, and it
True.
can be very frustrating and very challenging.
True. No, absolutely. Absolutely. So, moving on is other thing which I sometimes hear a lot is that, at the end of the day in India, there is, a saying which in Hindi, and I'll translate it for you, is apna khun hai. That means that it is the child is the parent's blood, right? It's a colloquial way of saying,
Right,
and
right.
the child will come back to you when the child is 18 or 20. So, why create all of these issues? The alienating parent will step back if you were to just move away from the child's life.
Look, there are circumstances where a child is so alienated that the rejected targeted parent does step back. They have no choice. It's been taken out of their hands.
Yeah.
I have a case right now where the targeted father has not seen his child in years. Okay. So, not because he or she wants it that way, it's been taken out of their hands. So,
Yeah.
it happens. It definitely happens. How do you tell a parent just to sit back so that and tell them that when the child hits 18 or 19 or 20, that child is going to come find you? Well, that probably is going to happen. But look at all the years that have been wasted. Look at all the years that have been lost. And we're still talking about an abusive process. So most parents fight on. Most parents continue to let the child know that they're there and that they love them and that they're available at any moment to reconnect.
Mhm.
But sometimes the alienation is so severe and so complete that the parent really has no other choice but not to have contact with that child. And it's sad.
Right. But do you think spontaneous resolution does happen in a significant percentage of cases?
Um,
Spontaneous reunification?
Spontaneous resolution meaning at that time or 10 years hence?
10 years henceforth.
I don't know. I don't know the data on that. I know some cases where that's happened, but I also know many where it doesn't really happen. So it's not something that I jump on very quickly. I think it does happen, but to
Right.
tell a parent just to sit back and wait for 10 years just seems so tragic and so untenable.
True, true. So, just the last question, and I'm going to end with something that Dr. Stephen Miller, who's a very well-renowned person,
Right.
said that the biggest problem with parental alienation is that it is so counterintuitive,
Yeah.
and there are so many amount of false assumptions that
Right.
take place. So, in our conversation, I'm sure I would have missed out on about three, four, or whatever some of them. What would your advice be to whether it's an evaluator or a judge or an attorney or an attorney? That what are the common pitfalls? What are the common mistakes that people do in such cases?
So let me talk about one that
Sure.
we haven't covered. Okay, and it's a
Right.
huge one. To
Yes.
me, it may be the most important one.
Yes.
The most common mistake that I see is that all the adults listen to the child and take what the child says at face value. End of discussion.
Right.
Well, that's a mistake. Okay, children are unwitting participants in alienation sometimes.
Yes.
Children are often too young to know what's in their best interest.
Right.
Too often, children have been so involved in the legal system by one parent or perhaps both parents that they're totally confused and they don't know which end is up. My point is that it is a huge mistake to simply listen to the child. I've had guardian ad litem after guardian ad litem in cases come to me and say, but the child says, well, that's great. I want to know what the child says. But to take it at face value is the absolute wrong thing to do 9 times out of 10. And again, it's one of those counterintuitive things. It makes sense. Why would you not talk to the child? Let's go by what the child says. But it's a mistake, and it can take you down a very, very difficult rabbit hole if all you do is listen to the child.
No, absolutely. Like I think Dr. Burnett said it to me in my last interview, where he said that child must have a voice, but not a choice,
Right.
right? So
Right.
we must give the child a voice, but
Even
just
even teenagers don't know what's in their best interest. Even a
right.
14-year-old or a 15-year-old or a 16-year-old, especially if they're embroiled in this alienation process, they don't know what's in their best interest. And you can't go simply by what they say.
True, true. Now, so I think one of the other counterintuitive thing which I was reading about in part of your article was that, it should go slowly. The whole process that, kind of ease the child into the reunification. Do not shift into shared parenting too quickly. What is your opinion on that?
I think the therapist involved has to figure that out. I've seen cases that can go very, very quickly, and I've seen other cases that is a struggle, it's ebb and flow, it's on and off. Every case is different, and I think the trick is to have the reunification therapist, the family therapist, who is sensitive enough to figure out the speed with which it can go. I don't think there's a blanket rule for everybody. I think it really does vary.
Well, what would be the the margins like? So what would be the extremes? So when you say quickly, it could be as quickly as maybe just about a week, right? Would
I
I be
think
correct?
I think quickly could be a matter of weeks, and I
Yeah,
think slowly could be a matter of months to longer.
yeah. So an outer limit of maybe saying a year or so is the maximum that we should look at. But fair enough. I get your point.
Right. I mean, there's
Yeah.
just wide variability, and I think it's up to the therapist to figure that out and to push as much as they can. And to sometimes it feels like you're walking through a minefield, and I think sometimes that just takes longer to do.
Sorry, I'll again ask you the last question for the third time, if you're okay with that.
Sure.
Would be, uh, what would your advice be to therapists? See, because where the issue comes in India is we do not really have any parental alienation specialists, people who've studied this in really a big way, right?
Right.
So sometimes they tend to be guided by their traditional principles of psychotherapy and behavioral therapy. So, do you see any difference between the two?
Absolutely. I think you have to understand the features and dynamics of parental alienation to get it right. I think if you just bring a traditional psychotherapy model to it, you miss it. And I can think of a case right now that just popped into my head where that's exactly what happened. This was somebody who was probably severely alienating a child, but yet was involved in traditional psychotherapy where the entirety of the alienation process was poorly understood, which means it wasn't addressed.
Right.
So I think it behooves the therapists in India to get
Mhm.
better acclimated, to understand it, to seek out supervision, to seek out experts, to get as much knowledge as possible about the aspects of parental alienation so that they can do a better job of doing it at home.
Wonderful. No, I think that's a great place to end. And thank you so much for your
Thank
time.
you. Thank
And
you.
thank you so much for sharing your deep expertise and knowledge. I think we'll really benefit a lot from this. But thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Pleasure.